Hi everyone, welcome to our lesson on the modernization of Japan. So our objectives and standards to identify how Japan modernized and to explain the policies of imperialism enacted by Japan. Take a look at the standards too, please. Okay, our vocab preview, the Meiji era. I want you to think about this and remember to answer this question in the think about this section. We've talked about how different countries can modernize and things they can do to make their countries more modern. So see if you can remember what a country can do to modernize, and if you can, give a brief explanation of it too. And our essential question: how did Japan modernize in the 1800s? Okay, so Japan had remained a largely isolated country prior to the 1800s. They had done some trading with China and some Dutch merchants in the Indochina area, but for the most part, they remained pretty isolated up until the 1800s. But they soon realized that they would need to trade with other countries in order to survive in the modern world. So beginning in the 1800s, other Western nations began pressuring the Japanese to open their ports, and still the Japanese refused to do so. In 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Tokyo Harbor with a letter from President Millard Fillmore. Now, the Japanese were really impressed with the fleet of American ships and its weapons, all these cannons, and how these ships use steam and were moving quickly around the country. So the Japanese decided that they really had to make a decision. So they decided to meet with the Americans and heard the request by President Fillmore for open trade with the country. Matthew Perry, who was in charge, also made it clear to the Japanese that he would be back in a year to learn the Japanese decision, and said that he would be coming back with more ships. So it was kind of a little bit of a threat, kind of underneath his breath, that he said, "Oh, we'll be back with more ships. We need a decision." So in 1854, a year later, the Treaty of Kanawha opened up trade with the United States. And soon after that, Japan would open up trade with other countries as well. Here's a picture of the meeting. Here's Commodore Perry there in the blue suit there, meeting with the Japanese. So the Japanese people were pretty angry that their leader had given into foreign demands to open up their ports. So he decided to step down, and a young emperor by the name of Mushito came to rule. Okay, he basically was very big with making Japan strong again, building up Japanese pride, building up Japanese nationalism, and he chose the name. I believe I'm saying this correctly. Meiji, which means enlightened one, and this will begin when he ruled. His time in power was known as the Meiji era. So the Meiji Emperor realized that the best way to limit Western influence was through modernization. He sent his diplomats to Europe and North America to study their ways, and Japan began to modernize its government, its military, and its education system in the country. And they also learned how to industrialize. So they learned, about, what we've already talked about in world history of factories and, making goods more effective and cheaper for people to buy. So they were becoming a modern country in many different ways. By the late 1800s, Japan had an extremely powerful military, and then they sought to expand their territory. So Japan first turned their sights to their neighbor, Korea. So they were very determined to show the world how strong they were. In 1876, Japan forced Korea to open their ports to them. China also had interest in the country, and they, to avoid a conflict, the Chinese and the Japanese decided to sign an agreement that they would have a hands-off policy in Korea, that they would not become involved with Korea to avoid a conflict, since both sides had interest there. However, in 1895, China sent troops to Korea to help put down a rebellion. Now, the Chinese were asked to do this by the Korean leader. So the Chinese sent troops there to help stop the rebellion. And again, since they'd already signed the agreement with Japan, this kind of angers Japan that the Chinese are sending troops there. So the Sino-Japanese War. So Japan sent troops to Korea to fight the Japanese, and this became known as the Sino-Japanese War. Now, it only lasted a few months, but it resulted in Japanese victory. Japan destroyed the Chinese Navy and pushed them out of Korea, and the Japanese gained a foothold in Manchuria. In 1895, Japan and China signed a treaty, and Japan did gain more territory. Okay, so wrap up here. Japan looked to modernize to expand its power and defend itself. Remember, the Japanese were kind of forced to open their ports to the Western powers. And so to protect themselves from the influence of Western powers, they decided to modernize and become a more powerful nation. Japan also realized that it could, since it was such a powerful nation, had a powerful military, that it could expand beyond its borders as well. And they did so with the Sino-Japanese War. And the next thing you're going to look at for the CYU, you'll learn about the Russo-Japanese War and find out what happened with that through a brief video on that. All right, so just make sure you answer the questions, and I will see and talk to you later.